Thomas Jefferson was an American statesman, diplomat, lawyer, architect, philosopher, and founding father who served as the third President of the United States from 1801 to 1809. He was the primary author of the Declaration of Independence. Following the American Revolutionary War and prior to becoming president in 1801, Jefferson was the nation's first U.S. Secretary of State under George Washington and then the nation's second vice president under John Adams. During the American Revolution, Jefferson represented Virginia at the Second Continental Congress and served as the second governor of Virginia from 1779 to 1781. In 1785, Congress appointed Jefferson U.S. Minister to France, where he served from 1785 to 1789. President Washington then appointed Jefferson the nation's first Secretary of State, where he served from 1790 to 1793. During this time, in the early 1790s, Jefferson and James Madison organized the Democratic-Republican Party to oppose the Federalist Party during the formation of the nation's first party system. Jefferson and Federalist John Adams became both friends and political rivals. In the 1796 U.S. presidential election between the two, Jefferson came in second, which made him Adams' vice president under the electoral laws of the time. 4 years later, in the 1800 presidential election, Jefferson again challenged Adams, and won the presidency. In 1804, Jefferson was re-elected overwhelmingly to a second term. As president, Jefferson assertively defended the nation's shipping and trade interests against Barbary pirates and aggressive British trade policies. Beginning in 1803, he promoted a Western expansionist policy with the Louisiana Purchase, which doubled the nation's geographic size. To make room for settlement, Jefferson began the process of Indian tribal removal from the newly acquired territory. As a result of peace negotiations with France, Jefferson was able to reduce military forces and expenditures. In his second presidential term, Jefferson was beset by difficulties at home, including the trial of his former vice president Aaron Burr. In 1807, Jefferson implemented the Embargo Act to defend the nation's industries from British threats to U.S. shipping, limiting foreign trade and stimulating the birth of the American manufacturing industry. Presidential scholars and historians generally praise Jefferson's public achievements, including his advocacy of religious freedom and tolerance, his peaceful acquisition of the Louisiana Territory from France, and his leadership in supporting the Lewis and Clark expedition. Jefferson is consistently ranked among the top 10 U.S. presidents, though his relationship with slavery continues to be debated. Jefferson was a slave owner, but condemned the slave trade in his draft of the Declaration of Independence and signed the act prohibiting importation of slaves in 1807. Since the 1790s, he was rumored to have had children by his slave Sally Hemings. According to scholarly consensus, Jefferson probably fathered at least 6 children with Hemings. Jefferson's writings and advocacy for human rights, including freedom of thought, speech, and religion, served as substantial inspirations to the American Revolution and subsequent Revolutionary War, in which the 13 colonies succeeded in breaking from British America and establishing the United States as a free and sovereign nation. Jefferson was a leading proponent of democracy, republicanism, and individual rights, and produced formative documents and decisions at the state, national, and international levels. Jefferson's writings have been used by proponents of libertarianism to argue in favor of natural rights and small government. Many words describe Thomas Jefferson. He is best remembered as the person who wrote the Declaration of Independence and third President of the United States. Jefferson was born April 13, 1743, on his father's plantation of Shadwell located along the Rivanna River in the Piedmont region of central Virginia at the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains. 1 His father Peter Jefferson was a successful planter and surveyor, and his mother Jane Randolph a member of one of Virginia's most distinguished families. When Jefferson was 14, his father died, and he inherited a sizable estate of approximately 5,000 acres. That inheritance included the house at Shadwell, but Jefferson dreamed of living on a mountain. Have you ever wondered where our third president was born? Learn about his early life, as presented by research archaeologist Derek Wheeler. In 1768 he contracted for the clearing of a 250 feet square site on the topmost point of the 868-foot mountain that rose above Shadwell and where he played as a boy. He would name this mountain Monticello, and the house that he would build and rebuild over a 40-year period took on this name as well. He would later refer to this ongoing project, the home that he loved, as my essay in architecture. The following year, after preparing the site, he began construction of a small brick structure that would consist of a single room with a walkout basement kitchen and workroom below. This would eventually be referred to as the South Pavilion and was where he lived first alone and then with his bride, Martha Wayles Skelton, following their marriage in January 1772. Unfortunately, Martha would never see the completion of Monticello. She died in the 10th year of their marriage, and Jefferson lost the cherished companion of my life. Their marriage produced 6 children but only 2 survived into adulthood, Martha, known as Patsy, and Mary, known as Maria or Polly. In this short video, hear how Martha W.S. Jefferson stands out as a vivid personality in the recollections of those who knew and remembered her. Along with the land, Jefferson inherited slaves from his father and even more slaves from his father-in-law, John Wayles. He also bought and sold enslaved people. In a typical year, he owned about 200, almost half of them under the age of 16. About 80 of these enslaved individuals lived at Monticello, the others lived on his adjacent Albemarle County farms, and on his Poplar Forest estate in Bedford County, Virginia. Over the course of his life, he owned over 600 enslaved people. These men, women, and children were integral to the running of his farms and building and maintaining his home at Monticello. Some were given training in various trades, others worked the fields, and some worked inside the main house. Many of the enslaved house servants were members of the Hemmings family. Elizabeth Hemmings and her children were a part of the Wayles estate, and tradition says that John Wayles was the father of 6 of Hemmings's children and, thus, they were the half-brothers and sisters of Jefferson's wife Martha. Jefferson gave the Hemmingses special positions, and the only slaves Jefferson freed in his lifetime and in his will were all Hemmingses, giving credence to the oral history. Years after his wife's death, Thomas Jefferson fathered at least 6 of Sally Hemmings's children. 4 survived to adulthood and are mentioned in Jefferson's plantation records. Their daughter Harriet and eldest son Beverly were allowed to leave Monticello during Jefferson's lifetime, and the 2 youngest sons, Madison and Eston, were freed in Jefferson's will. After a 2-year course of study at the College of William and Mary that he began at age 17, Jefferson read the law for 5 years with Virginia's prominent jurist, George Wythe, and recorded his first legal case in 1767. In 2 years he was elected to Virginia's House of Burgesses, the legislature in colonial Virginia. His first political work to gain broad acclaim was a 1774 draft of directions for Virginia's delegation to the First Continental Congress, reprinted as a summary view of the rights of British America. Here he boldly reminded George III that, he is no more than the chief officer of the people, appointed by the laws, and circumscribed with definite powers, to assist in working the great machine of government. Nevertheless, in his summary view he maintained that it was not the wish of Virginia to separate from the mother country. 6 But 2 years later, as a member of the Second Continental Congress and chosen to draft the Declaration of Independence, he put forward the colonies' arguments for declaring themselves free and independent states. The Declaration has been regarded as a charter of American and universal liberties. The document proclaims that all men are equal in rights, regardless of birth, wealth, or status, that those rights are inherent in each human, a gift of the Creator, not a gift of government, and that government is the servant and not the master of the people. Jefferson recognized that the principles he included in the Declaration had not been fully realized and would remain a challenge across time, but his poetic vision continues to have a profound influence in the United States and around the world. Abraham Lincoln made just this point when he declared, "All honor to Jefferson, to the man who, in the concrete pressure of a struggle for national independence by a single people, had the coolness, forecast, and capacity to introduce into a merely revolutionary document, an abstract truth, and so to embalm it there, that today and in all coming days, it shall be a rebuke and a stumbling block to the very harbingers of reappearing tyranny and oppression. After Jefferson left Congress in 1776, he returned to Virginia and served in the legislature. In late 1776, as a member of the new House of Delegates of Virginia, he worked closely with James Madison. Their first collaboration, to end the religious establishment in Virginia, became a legislative battle which would culminate with the passage of Jefferson's Statute for Religious Freedom in 1786. Elected governor from 1779 to 1781, he suffered an inquiry into his conduct during the British invasion of Virginia in his last year in office that, although the investigation was finally repudiated by the General Assembly, left him with a lifelong pricklishness in the face of criticism and generated a lifelong enmity toward Patrick Henry, whom Jefferson blamed for the investigation. "The investigation inflicted a wound on my spirit which will only be cured by the all-healing grave," Jefferson told James Monroe. During the brief private interval in his life following his governorship, Jefferson completed the one book which he authored, Notes on the State of Virginia. Several aspects of this work were highly controversial. With respect to slavery, in Notes Jefferson recognized the gross injustice of the institution, warning that because of slavery I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever. But he also expressed racist views of blacks' abilities, albeit he recognized that his views of their limitations might result from the degrading conditions to which they had been subjected for many years. With respect to religion, Jefferson's notes emphatically supported a broad religious freedom and opposed any establishment or linkage between church and state, famously insisting that it does me no injury for my neighbor to say there are 20 gods, or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. In 1784, he entered public service again, in France, first as Trade Commissioner and then as Benjamin Franklin's successor as U.S. Minister. During this period, he avidly studied European culture, sending home to Monticello books, seeds, and plants, along with architectural drawings, artwork, furniture, scientific instruments, and information. In 1790 he agreed to be the first Secretary of State under the new Constitution in the administration of the first President, George Washington. His tenure was marked by his opposition to the policies of Alexander Hamilton, which Jefferson believed both encouraged a larger and more powerful national government and were too pro-British. In 1796, as the presidential candidate of the nascent Democratic-Republican Party, he became vice president after losing to John Adams by 3 electoral votes. 4 years later, he defeated Adams in another hotly contested election and became president, the first peaceful transfer of authority from one party to another in the history of the young nation. Perhaps the most notable achievements of his first term were the purchase of the Louisiana Territory in 1803 and his support of the Lewis and Clark expedition. His second term, a time when he encountered more difficulties on both the domestic and foreign fronts, is most remembered for his efforts to maintain neutrality in the midst of the conflict between Britain and France. Unfortunately, his efforts did not avert a war with Britain in 1812 after he had left office and his friend and colleague, James Madison, had assumed the presidency. During the last 17 years of his life, Jefferson generally remained at Monticello, welcoming the many visitors who came to call upon the sage. During this period, he sold his collection of books, almost 6,500 volumes, to the government to form the nucleus of the Library of Congress before promptly beginning to purchase more volumes for his final library. Noting the irony, Jefferson famously told John Adams that I cannot live without books. Jefferson embarked on his last great public service at the age of 76 with the founding of the University of Virginia. He spearheaded the legislative campaign for its charter, secured its location, designed its buildings, planned its curriculum, and served as the first rector. Unfortunately, Jefferson's retirement was clouded by debt. Like so many Virginia planters, he had contended with debts most of his adult life, but along with the constant fluctuations in the agricultural markets, he was never able to totally liquidate the sizable debt attached to the inheritance from his father-in-law John Wayles. His finances worsened in retirement with the War of 1812 and the subsequent recession, headed by the Panic of 1819. He had felt compelled to sign on notes for a friend in 1818, who died insolvent 2 years later, leaving Jefferson with two $10,000 notes. This he labeled his coup de grace, as his extensive land holdings in Virginia, with the deflated land prices, could no longer cover what he owed. He complained to James Madison that the economic crisis had peopled the western states and drew off bidders for lands in Virginia and along the Atlantic seaboard. Ironically, Jefferson's greatest accomplishment during his presidency, the purchase of the port of New Orleans and the Louisiana Territory that opened the western migration, would contribute to his financial discomfort in his final years. A Monticello guide looks at the 3 contributions that Jefferson considered his greatest achievements. Despite his debts, when he died just a few hours before his friend John Adams on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, July 4, 1826, he was optimistic as to the future of the Republican experiment. Just 10 days before his death, he had declined an invitation to the planned celebration in Washington but offered his assurance, "All eyes are opened, or opening, to the rights of man." He could have filled several markers had he chosen to list his other public offices: Third President of the new United States, Vice President, Secretary of State, Diplomatic Minister, and Congressman. For his home state of Virginia he served as governor and member of the House of Delegates and the House of Burgesses, as well as filling various local offices, all tallied into almost 5 decades of public service. He also omitted his work as a lawyer, architect, writer, farmer, gentleman scientist, and life as patriarch of an extended family at Monticello, both white and black. He offered no particular explanation as to why only these 3 accomplishments should be recorded, but they were unique to Jefferson. Other men would serve as U.S. President and hold the public offices he had filled, but only he was the primary draftsman of the Declaration of Independence and of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, nor could others claim the position as the father of the University of Virginia. More importantly, through these 3 accomplishments he had made an enormous contribution to the aspirations of a new America and to the dawning hopes of repressed people around the world. He had dedicated his life to meeting the challenges of his age: political freedom, religious freedom, and educational opportunity. While he knew that we would continue to face these challenges through time, he believed that America's democratic values would become a beacon for the rest of the world. He never wavered from his belief in the American experiment. Thank you for watching this video.